Dad opened the door. On a freezing Christmas night, I stood trembling on my father's porch, clutching my soaking wet 1-year-old daughter. He brought his mistress home, I whispered. His mother packed up our things, threw the two of us out, and locked the door. My father looked at his little granddaughter shivering from the cold. Then he tightened his grip on the ring of keys in his hand. They picked the wrong family. My name is Erica. I am 33, and my husband thought he was discarding a helpless housewife to a poor retired mechanic. He had no idea he had just declared war on the owners of the very company that held his mortgage, his debts, and his career. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to show your true power to someone who underestimated your worth. The nightmare began 3 hours earlier. I was standing in the sprawling kitchen of our upscale Connecticut home pulling a heavy Christmas roast out of the oven. The house smelled of rosemary, garlic, and the expensive pine garlands my mother-in-law had insisted on draping over every banister. I had spent the entire day preparing for what was supposed to be a perfect holiday. My 1-year-old daughter Lily was playing quietly in her playpen near the dining room table. Barbara sat at the head of that table swirling a glass of wine and watching my every move with disdain. She wore a silk blouse and her signature string of pearls, always dressing as if a society photographer might burst through the door at any moment. "You overcooked the edges again, Erica," she noted casually, not even looking at the roast. "I do not understand how someone with so much free time manages to master so few skills." I bit my tongue and carefully placed the roasting pan on the stovetop. "It is perfectly medium rare inside, Barbara," I replied evenly. She sighed, a dramatic sound conveying profound disappointment. "Jason works incredibly long hours at the firm. The least you could do is match his ambition in the home, since you have no ambition elsewhere." I wiped my hands on an apron and took a deep breath. I chose not to engage. She was obsessed with old money status and viewed my quiet, practical nature as a personal insult to her family line. I simply turned back to the counter, preparing the side dishes and waiting for my husband to come home from his supposed late meeting at the office. The door opened with a heavy click, letting in freezing winter air. I stepped out of the kitchen with a smile, ready to greet Jason. My smile froze. Jason did not walk in alone. He walked into the foyer holding hands with a woman I instantly recognized. Her name was Brittany. She was 24, a junior executive from his firm, wearing a designer coat and looking around with calculating eyes. Jason dropped his briefcase by the door. He did not flinch when he saw me standing there. He did not let go of her hand. "Erica," he said, his voice completely devoid of warmth or guilt. "We need to talk." I stared at their intertwined fingers, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "What is she doing here, Jason? It is Christmas Eve." Brittany offered a patronizing smile, shifting her weight in her expensive boots. She looked entirely too comfortable. Jason let out a breath, looking at me as if I were a minor inconvenience he finally had to deal with. "I am not going to drag this out," he said smoothly. "Brittany and I are in love. We have been seeing each other for a long time, and she is moving in tonight. I want a divorce." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The room seemed to tilt. I looked from my husband to the young woman standing in my foyer, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of his announcement. "You are bringing your mistress into our home on Christmas Eve?" I asked, my voice rising. "Our daughter is right there in the dining room." Before Jason could answer, the scrape of a chair echoed through the house. Barbara stood up from the dining table. She did not look shocked. She did not look horrified. In fact, she looked incredibly satisfied. She walked very calmly into the kitchen, reached under the sink, and pulled out 2 heavy-duty black garbage bags. She walked over and tossed them onto the floor right at my feet. "Jason deserves a woman who fits our social standing," Barbara sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "Someone with drive, with class, with a future. This house is in my name, Erica, and as of this moment you are trespassing. Pack your things and leave." I stared at the black plastic bags crumpled on the expensive hardwood floor, the reality of the ambush setting in. "You knew about this," I said to Barbara, my voice trembling with rage. "You planned this together to throw me out of my own home on a holiday." "It is my home," Barbara corrected sharply. "You have just been a guest who overstayed her welcome." I shook my head, stepping toward Jason. "You cannot do this. You cannot just kick your wife and your 1-year-old daughter out into the freezing snow because you decided to play house with a junior executive. Where are we supposed to go?" Jason crossed his arms, his handsome face twisting into a cruel, arrogant smirk. "Go back to where you came from, Erica. Go cry to your father. He can clear out a spot in his garage for you. It is about time you went back to your roots. After all, he is just a greasy mechanic who fixes toilets and changes oil for a living. You never belonged in our world anyway. You were always just a temporary charity project." The sheer disrespect in his voice regarding my father made my blood run cold. They truly believed I came from nothing. They honestly believed my father was a poor, struggling laborer because he preferred wearing denim and driving a rusted truck instead of flaunting wealth. I moved toward Lily and her playpen, my hands shaking as I scooped up my daughter. She whimpered, sensing the tension in the room. "I will call a lawyer," I told Jason, holding my baby tight against my chest. "You will not get away with this." Barbara marched forward, her face flushed with sudden anger. She grabbed my shoulder and physically shoved me toward the entryway. "Get out of my house right now," she shouted. "You have nothing. You are nothing. You cannot afford a lawyer on a housewife allowance, so do not bother threatening us." She shoved me again, harder this time. I stumbled backward, clutching Lily desperately to protect her from the impact. I fell through the open front doorway and stumbled onto the snow-covered porch. The freezing wind bit through my thin indoor clothes instantly. "Merry Christmas," Erica Jason said, wrapping his arm around Brittany. Barbara slammed the door shut. I heard the deadbolt lock. I put Lily into the car and checked my secret banking app before driving straight to my father Thomas for my ultimate hidden financial revenge. The drive to my father's house was a blur of icy roads, but my mind had never been clearer. I carried Lily inside, wrapping her in the quilt my father had warming by the radiator. Thomas asked no questions. He offered no useless platitudes. He simply took my coat and poured me a cup of black coffee. As I wrapped my freezing hands around the mug, my phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a message from Jason. It read, "Drop the spare keys in the mailbox tomorrow morning. If you make this difficult, I am canceling your phone plan and closing the joint checking. Do not test me, Erica." I stared at the glowing words. A year ago, a message like that would have sent me into a panic. I would have cried and wondered how I was going to buy groceries or diapers. Jason thrived on that dynamic. He needed to feel like the powerful provider, the generous executive who rescued me from my blue-collar roots. He genuinely believed that without him I would be destitute. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the bitter heat ground me in reality. I looked across the kitchen island at my father. He was already wearing his reading glasses, his grease-stained coveralls swapped for a simple gray sweater. "Did he text you?" Thomas asked, his voice low and steady. I slid the phone across the counter. "He wants the spare keys to the sedan. He is threatening to cut off my phone and the joint accounts if I do not comply." Thomas let out a short, humorless laugh. He read the message twice, his jaw tightening with each passing second. "He thinks he holds all the cards." I nodded, picking up my phone and silencing it. "Let him think that. It makes people sloppy." My father pushed his chair back and stood up. "Put the baby in the guest room crib. It is time we got to work." I carried Lily down the hall, gently placing her in the heavy wooden crib that had been mine 30 years ago. I lingered for a moment, watching her chest rise and fall in the dim light. She was safe. Now I needed to make sure our future was untouchable. I walked back out to the hallway and followed my father toward the basement door. To the outside world, my father was Thomas the mechanic. He drove a battered truck, lived in a modest ranch house in a working-class neighborhood, and spent his weekends tinkering with old engines. Jason and Barbara had mocked him relentlessly for it, calling him uncultured and low-class. They had no idea that the grease under his fingernails was just a hobby. They had no idea that the modest ranch house was a fortress bought and paid for in cash 3 decades ago. My father unlocked the heavy wooden door leading to the basement. We walked down the creaking wooden stairs, but at the bottom the illusion of the working-class mechanic vanished entirely. Facing us was a solid steel security door equipped with a biometric scanner. Thomas placed his thumb on the glass pad. A soft green light scanned his print, and the heavy locking mechanism engaged with a deep metallic thud. The door swung open smoothly, revealing a space that looked like it belonged in a corporate espionage firm. The air conditioning hummed, keeping the massive server racks along the back wall perfectly chilled. 6 high-definition monitors stretched across a custom mahogany desk, glowing with real-time global market data, offshore account tracking, and corporate acquisition portfolios. This was the nerve center of Apex Holdings. Thomas was not a mechanic. He was the founder and sole owner of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm that specialized in hostile takeovers and corporate debt restructuring. He built the empire quietly, completely insulated from the flashy, ego-driven society circles that Jason and Barbara worshipped. And I was not just a quiet housewife who occasionally balanced the checkbook. I was a senior forensic accountant, and for the last 7 years, I had been the shadow chief financial officer of Apex Holdings. I hunted down hidden assets, unraveled complex corporate fraud, and orchestrated the financial maneuvers that allowed my father to acquire failing companies for pennies on the dollar. I slowly took my seat at the right side of the heavy desk, waking up my primary terminal. The soft blue glow of the screens illuminated my face as I flexed my fingers over the keyboard. Thomas sat beside me, pulling up the master database. For years I had kept my profession a secret from Jason. When we first met, he was so eager to play the role of the wealthy savior that I simply let him. He never asked about my days in detail, assuming my remote accounting job was just basic bookkeeping for small local businesses. Barbara had dismissed my career entirely, telling her country club friends that I was practically unemployed. They believed I was financially dependent on Jason and his 6-figure salary. They were about to learn what real wealth looked like. Pull up Barbara financial profile. My father instructed, his tone shifting from paternal comfort to absolute corporate ruthlessness. Let us see exactly what kind of dynasty this woman is protecting. I accessed the secure financial databases that Apex Holdings utilized for deep background checks on corporate acquisitions. It took less than 3 minutes to bypass the standard public records and dig into the secured banking networks. Barbara had spent the entire evening bragging about her social standing, her pristine credit, and the historical wealth of her family name. She used that supposed wealth as a weapon to make me feel small, to justify throwing her granddaughter out into the snow so her son could upgrade to a younger model. I routed my search through our secure servers, pulling her primary tax returns, property deeds, and banking histories. The firewall protecting her private banking details required a secondary bypass, but my forensic algorithms sliced through the outdated encryption easily. What I saw on the screen made me pause. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the endless rows of red numbers, deferred payments, and massive lines of credit. I ran the diagnostic again, assuming the system had pulled an error. It had not. "Just look at this," I said, pointing to the aggregate debt column displayed on the secondary monitor. Thomas rolled his chair closer, adjusting his glasses as he read the data. His eyes widened slightly before narrowing into a sharp, predatory gaze. Barbara projected the image of a woman sitting on millions. She hosted lavish charity dinners, drove imported luxury cars, and wore jewelry that cost more than my first college tuition. But the numbers on my screen told a completely different story. The Grand Connecticut estate she claimed to own, outright the very house she had just kicked me out of, was leveraged to the absolute limit. She had 0 liquid assets. Her savings accounts were overdrawn, and her credit cards were kept afloat by constantly shifting balances through high-interest personal loans. The old family money she constantly lorded over everyone was a complete fabrication. The firewall crumbled entirely, laying her entire life bare before me. Barbara was not an aristocrat. She was nothing but a fraud. She was entirely bankrupt, and the so-called family wealth had dried up a full decade ago. I stared at the blinking red numbers on the monitor, letting the reality of Barbara wash over me. Before I could even begin to trace where her money had vanished, my cell phone vibrated violently against the mahogany desk. I picked it up, expecting another pathetic demand from Jason. Instead, the name flashing on the screen belonged to my mother-in-law. The text was a solid block of aggressive demands reading, "You will meet my attorney tomorrow at noon to sign a quitclaim deed. You will formally waive any and all marital rights to the Connecticut house. If you attempt to claim a single dime of my family equity or drag this out in court, I will personally call Child Protective Services. I will tell them you are an unfit, unemployed mother living in a dangerous environment with an unhinged mechanic. Sign the deed, Erica, or you will never see Lily again." I read the words twice. Barbara was not just trying to protect her assets. She was trying to weaponize my child against me. She knew my first instinct would be to protect Lily at all costs. She assumed I would panic and sign anything to keep Child Protective Services away from my door. I handed the phone to my father. Thomas read the message, his face devoid of emotion, but his eyes hardening into a terrifying glare. He handed the phone back to me. "Are you going to cry?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I looked at him, then back at the glowing screens. "No," I replied, tossing the phone down. "I'm going to bury her." I turned my attention back to the keyboard, my fingers flying across the keys. If Barbara was this desperate to get me to sign a quitclaim deed on Christmas Eve, she needed me entirely disconnected from the property title before whatever house of cards she had built collapsed. I pulled up the primary deed and mortgage filings for the Connecticut estate. The house had been purchased 30 years ago by Barbara and her late husband. According to public records, the mortgage was paid off in full shortly after his death. That was the story Jason had always told me. He loved bragging about how his family owned the sprawling property, outright a supposed testament to their generational wealth. But the secure banking servers told a different story entirely. I opened a new window and bypassed the encryption on the regional bank that handled Barbara and her personal accounts. It was a mid-sized institution called Oakmont Trust, known for catering to wealthy clients in the tri-state area. I accessed their internal loan origination database and ran a search for Barbara. A cascading list of documents flooded my secondary monitor. I clicked on the most recent files and my jaw dropped. Barbara did not own the house outright. Over the past 10 years, she had treated the estate like an endless automated teller machine. She had taken out a secondary mortgage and then a third and then a fourth. "Look at the dates," I said, pointing to the screen. Thomas leaned in, analyzing the loan schedules. "She refinanced every time the previous loan reached its limit. She is bleeding the equity dry just to maintain the illusion of wealth." I opened the loan applications to see how a bank could possibly approve this level of debt for a woman with zero verifiable income. The answer was glaringly obvious. It was massive and undeniable loan fraud. Barbara had submitted falsified tax returns, inflated asset appraisals, and fabricated investment portfolios. She had even forged signatures from a fake accounting firm to verify her supposed independent wealth. I traced the entire flow of the borrowed funds cross-referencing the loan disbursements with her personal checking accounts. The money was not going toward investments or property improvements. It was pouring directly into the gaping maw of her extravagant lifestyle. I watched hundreds of thousands of dollars hemorrhage into elite country club initiation fees, luxury vehicle leases, designer wardrobes, and private charity galas. She was using illegal loan money to buy her way into high society, pretending to be a philanthropist while stealing from the regional bank. But the fraud did not stop with Barbara. I tracked a series of recurring wire transfers from Barbara account directly into Jason's personal checking account. My husband, the supposedly brilliant and successful corporate vice president, was receiving a massive monthly allowance from his mother. The vacations he surprised me with, the expensive gifts he bought, the luxury lifestyle he claimed his salary, provided it was all funded by Barbara and her fraudulent mortgages. Jason was entirely complicit in the illusion. They were both drowning in debt, smiling for the cameras while standing on a trapdoor. "This bank is a complete disaster," my father said, his eyes scanning the overall financial health of Oakmont Trust. "If their loan officers are pushing through applications with this level of blatant forgery, their compliance department is either completely incompetent or actively participating in the fraud." He tapped a few keys on his side of the desk, bringing up Oakmont Trust corporate profile. "The bank is severely overleveraged. They have a massive portfolio of bad debt and toxic loans. They are currently seeking a silent capital injection to avoid regulatory scrutiny and total collapse." Thomas turned to look at me, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey wander into a dead end. "Apex Holdings has been looking to expand our regional banking portfolio," he said softly. "I think Oakmont Trust would make an excellent acquisition. Do you agree, Erica?" I understood exactly what he was suggesting. It was brilliant. It was silent. It was absolute annihilation. If Apex Holdings purchased Oakmont Trust, we would instantly own all of their assets, their portfolios, and their debt. We would own the fraudulent mortgages Barbara had taken out against the Connecticut estate. I ran a rapid liquidity assessment on Oakmont Trust, determining the exact amount of capital required to execute an immediate hostile buyout. The number was substantial for a normal investor, but for Apex Holdings it was loose change. I initiated the secure acquisition protocols routing the purchase through 3 of our holding companies to mask the origin of the funds. My father authorized the transaction with his biometric signature and a series of secure access codes. The progress bar on the screen filled in a matter of seconds. We did not need to negotiate with a board of directors or wait for quarterly approvals. We held the cash, and Oakmont Trust was desperate to survive. The transaction cleared the global banking network instantly. I watched the confirmation screen flash green, signaling the transfer of ownership. I printed the internal acquisition documents and held the warm paper in my hands. I looked down at the signature line where my name now sat as the primary controlling officer of the newly acquired banking asset. Barbara had threatened to ruin me. She had threatened to take my daughter and leave me destitute on the streets. She thought she was untouchable because her name was on the deed to the house. But she had forgotten that the deed was worthless when the bank owned the whole property. I set the paper down on the mahogany desk and looked at my father. "I am not just a trespasser anymore," I whispered. "I am officially her debt holder." The glow of the monitors reflected off my father as he nodded slowly. We sat in the hum of the server room, letting the magnitude of our move settle over us. I had just purchased the financial chain around my mother-in-law neck. I turned away to grab my coffee mug when my cell phone vibrated violently against the desk. A piercing chime echoed through the silent basement. It was a fraud alert from my bank. I tapped the notification and watched as red banners cascaded down my screen. Access denied. Account frozen. Insufficient privileges. I navigated to the primary joint checking account Jason and I shared for our entire marriage. The balance, which held our emergency savings yesterday morning, now read 0. Jason had drained every penny, leaving me with absolutely no visible assets. Before I could process the petty theft, my email inbox chimed. The sender was a high-priced family law attorney in downtown Hartford. I opened the message and felt the blood drain from my face. Attached was an emergency ex parte motion for full temporary custody of our daughter. I skimmed the dense legal jargon, my eyes locking onto the specific devastating allegations Jason had submitted to a sitting judge under penalty of perjury. He claimed I had suffered a mental breakdown and abandoned our family home on Christmas Eve. He blatantly stated I was currently unemployed, unstable, and living in a hazardous slum. He formally requested immediate and sole physical custody of Lily, arguing that my complete lack of financial stability made me a direct threat to her well-being. A cold knot twisted deep in my stomach. Jason was not just trying to bully me into signing away the house. He was actively trying to take my only child away from me forever. He knew exactly how the legal system worked. He knew that by abruptly draining our joint accounts and leveraging his massive corporate salary, he could easily paint a picture of a destitute, unstable woman to any family court judge who did not look closely enough. He wanted to leave me with zero visible assets, so I could not afford a retainer to fight back against his lawyers. He wanted me broken, terrified, and begging him for mercy. I thought about my beautiful little girl sleeping peacefully upstairs in the wooden crib, completely unaware that her father was trying to erase her mother from her life. The cold terror in my stomach ignited into a roaring, uncontainable fire. I did not cry or panic. I slammed my coffee mug down onto the desk with a sharp crack. Thomas looked over, his expression shifting from cold corporate focus to deep paternal alarm. "What did he do?" my father asked, leaning forward. "He just filed an emergency ex parte motion for sole physical custody," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, trembling whisper. "He drained our joint checking account completely. He told the family court I am a mentally unstable, unemployed woman living in a dangerous slum. He is trying to take Lily away from me." Thomas did not say a single word. He simply turned back to his keyboard and brought up a new encrypted terminal window. The soft green light of the biometric scanner flashed again as he granted me unrestricted administrative access to the deepest levels of the Apex Holdings financial tracking grid. "You know exactly what to do," Thomas said quietly. "Find every single dollar he has ever touched." I cracked my knuckles and leaned intently into my glowing monitors. Jason wanted to play a ruthless game of financial warfare against a woman he arrogantly believed was nothing more than a naive, helpless housewife. He was about to find out exactly what a highly trained senior forensic accountant could accomplish when backed by the limitless capital and unmatched server power of a private equity firm. I started with our drained joint account. I pulled the exact routing numbers from the withdrawal transaction Jason had executed minutes ago. He had moved the stolen funds into a newly established private account at a massive national bank. But I certainly did not stop there. I went deep back through 5 full years of our shared banking history. I began tracking every single deposit, every mundane withdrawal, every credit card payment, and every international wire transfer Jason had ever authorized. For hours, the only sound in the underground basement was the rapid-fire clicking of my mechanical keyboard and the low, steady hum of the server cooling units. I built a massive, complex digital spreadsheet mapping out his total income versus his actual expenditures. The numbers immediately began to clash violently. Jason made an impressive, lucrative salary as a Golden Boy vice president at his regional logistics firm, but his personal spending habits were astronomically higher than his actual take-home pay. I successfully isolated a series of massive unexplained wire transfers that had been quietly funneling out of our joint savings over the last 18 consecutive months. He had been slowly and deliberately bleeding our accounts dry long before he brought his mistress home on Christmas Eve. I traced the ultimate destination of those missing funds, fully expecting to find a secret brokerage account, or perhaps the down payment on the luxury downtown condo he planned to share with Brittany. Instead, the money vanished into a highly complex web of corporate shell companies. The routing sequences were designed to look like standard corporate investments, but they were incredibly sloppy. Jason was just an arrogant executive, not a trained forensic accountant. He used predictable numerical patterns and lazy encryption layers. I bypassed the dummy corporations effortlessly and followed the hidden money trail directly to the Cayman Islands. A massive offshore account flashed onto my screen. I broke through the final layer of security, and the complete financial ledger populated right in front of me. The current balance was absolutely staggering. It was not just the missing money stolen from our joint savings. The offshore account held hundreds of thousands of dollars. The deposits were frequent, occurring every 2 weeks like clockwork. I cross-referenced the offshore deposit dates directly with the internal payment schedules of his logistics firm. The exact amounts perfectly matched the supply chain vendor payments his company regularly authorized for international shipping. Jason was not just illegally hiding marital assets. He was actively embezzling massive amounts of money directly from his employer. He was routing corporate vendor payments into a dummy corporation and then funneling the untraceable cash straight into his private offshore hideaway. I quickly opened the detailed withdrawal history on the offshore account to see exactly what he was doing with the stolen corporate funds. The ledger read like a catalog of absolute vanity and deceit. There were massive recurring payments covering the severely overdue initiation fees and monthly dues at Barbara Elite Country Club. He was literally stealing from his logistics company just to keep his bankrupt mother from being kicked out of her high society circles. But the absolute worst discovery was yet to come. I found a long string of massive luxury purchases authorized over the last 6 months. Platinum necklaces, diamond earrings, and a custom-tailored designer wardrobe. All of it was shipped directly to the home address of his 24-year-old mistress. He was using embezzled funds to buy Brittany loyalty while planning to leave his wife and daughter with nothing. The evidence was completely irrefutable. Jason was a thief. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, letting the chilling reality of his massive corporate crimes wash over me. He was not just a cheating husband trying to steal my daughter. He was actively draining his employer to fund his mistress and his mother. Thomas placed a hand on my shoulder, his expression a rigid mask of cold calculation. My phone lit up on the desk. The screen displayed a new message from Barbara. I picked it up and read the text aloud so my father could hear. Erica. The message began with typical arrogance. We are hosting a New Year Eve gala tomorrow to introduce Brittany to our circle. You left the kitchen in a state on Christmas Eve and your trash is cluttering the guest bedroom. If you come scrub the floors and pack up your belongings, I will put in a good word with Jason regarding custody. Do not test me. This is your only chance to ever see Lily again. I felt my jaw tighten. Barbara was using my daughter as leverage to get free maid service for her party. She wanted to humiliate me. She wanted me scrubbing her floors while her new daughter-in-law watched. Thomas pulled a specialized silver flash drive from a locked drawer. He set it next to my phone. Let her think she has broken you, he said quietly. We need physical access to his local network. We need the local files to prove he initiated the transfers from his home IP address. Play the part of the defeated wife, Erica. Get inside that house. I slipped the flash drive into the pocket of my worn denim jeans. I dressed down, choosing a faded sweater and pulling my hair into a knot. I needed to look like the broken, destitute woman Jason described in his custody filing. I drove my father's rusted truck back to the Connecticut estate, parking it at the end of the long driveway. I knocked on the heavy oak door. It swung open to reveal Barbara and Brittany standing in the grand foyer. They were holding crystal flutes filled with mimosas. Brittany was wearing one of my favorite cashmere cardigans. I pushed the immediate surge of anger down and forced my shoulders to slump. You took your time, Barbara snapped, taking a sip of her mimosa. The cleaning supplies are exactly where you left them under the sink. I want the grout spotless. The caterers arrive tomorrow, and I will not have them working in a filthy environment. Brittany giggled, leaning against the banister. Make sure you use the lemon polish, Erica. Jason absolutely hates the smell of bleach. He told me it reminds him of how you used to clean. I swallowed my pride and nodded silently, playing the role of the obedient broken housewife perfectly. I walked straight past them and headed into the massive gourmet kitchen. I pulled the heavy bucket of cleaning supplies from under the sink and dropped to my knees on the cold tile floor. I grabbed a sponge and began scrubbing the grout lines just as I was ordered. Barbara and Brittany followed me, leaning against the marble island and sipping their drinks. They watched me work, treating my humiliation as their morning entertainment. Are you sure we should even let her touch the good crystal? Brittany asked loudly. Jason said she completely lost her grip on reality. Barbara let out a sharp, cruel laugh. Oh, do not worry, dear. She knows better than to break anything. She is just desperate to see that child of hers again. It is truly pathetic how clingy some women can be. I kept my head down, hiding the cold smile forming on my lips. They did not notice me reaching into my bucket of supplies. Hidden beneath the sponges and brushes were 3 tiny audio recording devices provided by Apex Holdings' corporate security division. They were no larger than a shirt button. I shifted my position, crawling toward the threshold between the kitchen and the formal dining room, while Barbara launched into a detailed description of the caviar menu she had ordered for the New Year Eve gala. I quickly peeled the adhesive backing off the first device. I pressed it firmly under the lip of the heavy mahogany dining table, completely out of sight. I moved toward the decorative baseboards near the grand staircase, planting a second bug, right where it would catch every conversation in the foyer. They thought I was scrubbing away a phantom stain. I was actually wiring their entire house for sound. I finished the kitchen floor and stood up, wiping my hands on a towel. "I will go upstairs and pack the rest of my things," I said, keeping my voice submissive and weak. Barbara waved her hand dismissively, pouring herself another mimosa. "Make it quick. We have the decorators coming at 2 to set up the floral arrangements. I do not want your truck sitting in my driveway when they arrive." I walked up the grand staircase, my heart pounding a steady rhythmic beat against my ribs. I bypassed the guest bedroom entirely and slipped silently into Jason's private home office. The room smelled of expensive cologne and leather. I moved quickly to his massive oak desk. Just as Thomas had predicted, Jason had left his personal laptop sitting right on the blotter. He had not bothered to close it or lock the screen. I pulled the silver flash drive from my pocket and inserted it directly into the USB port. The Apex Holdings proprietary cloning software launched instantly, bypassing his basic desktop security in a matter of seconds. A small black progress bar appeared on the screen, calculating the data transfer. I stood frozen behind his desk, listening to the faint sounds of Barbara and Brittany laughing in the kitchen below. The progress bar crawled forward, transferring his encrypted email files, his hidden browser histories, and his locally stored corporate ledgers. Finally, the screen flashed a tiny green checkmark. The drive had perfectly cloned his entire digital life. I pulled the silver drive from the port, slipped it into my pocket, and grabbed a cardboard box of sweaters from the guest room to complete the illusion. I walked back down the stairs carrying the cardboard box. Barbara and Brittany were now sitting in the living room, flipping through a magazine. I did not say a word to them. I simply walked straight down the hallway and out the back patio door, stepping into the biting winter air. I threw the box into the bed of my father-rusted truck and climbed into the driver's seat. As I turned the key in the ignition, my secure mobile phone pinged with a high-priority notification. The cloning software on the flash drive had automatically synced with the Apex Holdings server, linking the data to my mobile access. I pulled up the newly decrypted files on my phone screen. The system had already scanned Jason's local hard drive for key financial signatures. It isolated the original incorporation documents for the Cayman Islands offshore account. I zoomed in on the glowing screen. There, at the very bottom of the corporate charter, right next to Jason, forged authorization, was a secondary signature line. It was signed in clear, looping cursive. The signature belonged to Brittany. Jason was not just embezzling money to buy her gifts. He had legally named his 24-year-old mistress as the co-signer and primary beneficiary of the stolen corporate funds. The trap had just snapped shut. I stared at the glowing screen, letting the icy winter air bite my cheeks. Jason had handed me the exact weapon I needed. I drove back, feeling profound calm. The frantic mother was dead. In her place was a forensic accountant with undeniable proof of a felony. The next morning, I sat drinking black coffee when my laptop chimed with an email. It was from a senior partner at an expensive family law firm. I opened the message and found a digital non-disclosure agreement attached alongside a formal custody proposal. The terms were insulting. If I signed the agreement binding me to absolute silence regarding Jason and his assets, he would allow me weekend visitation with Lily. I would walk away with zero alimony and no claim to the estate. If I refused the email, warned that Jason would proceed with an emergency ex parte motion, claiming I was an unfit mother fighting for sole physical custody. He was trying to starve me out. I did not bother replying. I closed the laptop and walked to the guest bedroom. It was time to stop playing the role of the defeated housewife. I reached into the closet and pulled out a heavy garment bag. Inside was a bespoke charcoal gray designer suit. It was tailored perfectly sharp, intimidating, and undeniably powerful. I slipped into the slacks and buttoned the crisp silk blouse, taking a moment to look at my reflection. I swept my hair back into a sleek twist and applied dark red lipstick. I looked like a woman who dismantled corporations for a living. I grabbed my leather briefcase, sliding the cloned flash drive and a thickly bound copy of my forensic audit inside. I walked out to the kitchen and kissed Lily on the forehead. Thomas looked at my suit and gave an approving nod. I walked out the front door, bypassing the rusted truck. Thomas had arranged for a black town car to be delivered. I climbed into the back seat and gave the driver the address for the corporate headquarters of Jason Logistics firm. The drive took 45 minutes, winding through the affluent corporate parks. I used the time to mentally rehearse my presentation. The headquarters was a massive glass and steel structure, projecting an image of modern corporate success. I stepped out of the town car and walked through the sliding glass doors. The grand lobby was a cavernous space filled with rushing executives. I knew exactly how to navigate this environment. I walked directly toward the secure elevator banks, ignoring the main reception desk. A young security guard stepped forward, attempting to intercept me, but I did not break my stride. I offered him an impatient glare and flashed a generic corporate identification badge from my briefcase. He hesitated just long enough for me to slip past him and step into an open elevator. I hit the button for the top floor, knowing that was where the executive suites were located. The doors chimed open, revealing a thickly carpeted hallway lined with frosted glass walls. I walked purposefully past the cubicles, heading straight for the corner suite. The frosted glass door read, "Mr. Carter, Chief Executive Officer." A stern-looking executive assistant sat at a desk outside, guarding the entrance. She looked up as I approached. "May I help you?" she asked, her tone dripping with polite condescension. "Do you have an appointment with Mr. Carter?" I did not pause or offer a smile. I walked past her desk and pushed the heavy glass door open, stepping directly into the massive corner office. Mr. Carter was an older man with silver hair and a sharp, tailored suit, sitting behind a glass desk. He looked up from his computer monitor, his brow furrowing in deep confusion and sudden anger. "Excuse me," he demanded, his voice booming. "You cannot just walk in here. Who are you, and how did you get past security?" I closed the heavy door behind me, shutting out the protests of his flustered assistant. I walked to the center of the room and placed my leather briefcase on his pristine desk. "My name is Erica," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am the wife of your Vice President of Regional Logistics, Jason. And I am here to do you a massive favor, Mr. Carter." The CEO narrowed his eyes, leaning back in his leather chair. He waved a hand, silencing his assistant, who had just rushed into the room. "It is fine, Diane," he said, never taking his eyes off me. "Give us a moment." The assistant retreated, pulling the door shut. Carter looked back at me, his expression a mix of curiosity and intense annoyance. "I know who Jason is," he said slowly. "He is one of my top executives. But that does not explain why his wife is barging into my office on a Tuesday morning." I unlatched my briefcase and pulled out the thick-bound forensic audit, setting it squarely on the desk in front of him. I placed the silver flash drive right on top of the paper stack. "I am not here as a wife," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I am a senior forensic accountant for Apex Holdings. And your golden boy vice president has been robbing you blind for the last 18 months. Carter let out a short, dismissive laugh. "That is a very serious and highly actionable accusation to make against one of my best employees," he said, crossing his arms. "Jason brings in millions in revenue for this firm. I think you need to leave before I have you escorted out by building security." I did not move a single inch. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the cover of the audit report. "Jason does not bring in revenue," I countered, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "He creates fake vendor accounts. He authorizes massive payments to dummy logistics companies, and he funnels your corporate capital directly into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He has embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars right under your nose, Mr. Carter." The amusement vanished from the older man's face instantly. The mention of specific offshore locations and dummy vendors struck a nerve. He leaned forward slowly, his eyes darting to the thick report on his desk. He reached out and flipped open the cover. I watched as his eyes scanned the first page of the executive summary. I had structured the data perfectly, highlighting the exact dates, routing numbers, and corresponding corporate approvals that bore Jason's digital signature. Carter flipped to the next page, and then the next. The silence in the room grew suffocating. The only sound was the sharp rustle of paper as the CEO of the logistics firm realized his company was bleeding cash. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck began to bulge against his crisp white collar. He stared at the copies of the wire transfers showing company money paying for country club fees and luxury jewelry sent to a 24-year-old woman. "This is irrefutable," Carter whispered, shaking with rage. "That arrogant thief," he roared, snatching the receiver from his desk. "I am calling the police now," he snarled. I stepped forward firmly, holding his hand down. "Wait until New Year Eve," I said. "I have a better stage for his termination." Mr. Carter stared at me for a long moment, his hand slowly pulling away from the desk phone. The blinding rage in his eyes shifted into a cold, calculating respect. He looked back down at the detailed financial ledgers, tracing the undeniable paper trail that linked his trusted vice president to a massive embezzlement scheme. He nodded once, a sharp and definitive motion. He promised to keep the entire investigation strictly confidential until the clock struck midnight on my terms. I left the corporate headquarters feeling a profound sense of absolute control. I climbed back into the waiting town car and watched the polished glass building fade into the distance. The drive back to my father's house passed in a quiet blur of anticipation. I was no longer the terrified woman wrapping her child in a quilt on a freezing winter night. I was the architect of their impending destruction. When I walked through the heavy steel door of the basement nerve center, Thomas was already waiting at the mahogany desk. I set my leather briefcase down and gave him a silent nod of triumph. We had Jason entirely locked in. Now it was time to handle Barbara. Before I could even wake up my primary monitor, my personal cell phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and saw a social media notification. Brittany had made a new post on Instagram. She had blocked me weeks ago, but she foolishly left her profile public, knowing full well I had secondary accounts I used to monitor local community events. I tapped the notification and her smiling face filled my screen. She was standing in the grand foyer of the Connecticut estate, posing in front of the sweeping mahogany staircase. She was wearing a plunging red dress holding a crystal glass of champagne. But my eyes locked onto her chest. Resting against her collarbone was a delicate vintage diamond pendant. It was my favorite necklace. It was an antique heirloom my late grandmother had given me, a piece of jewelry I had left safely tucked away in the back of my closet when Jason forced me out into the snow. Below the photograph, the caption read, "Upgrading his life out with the old in with the better." The sheer audacity of the theft made my pulse quicken. Jason had not just allowed his mistress to move into my house and sleep in my bed. He had actively given her my personal family heirlooms to flaunt on the internet like trophies. They were treating my entire existence like a thrift store they could raid at their convenience. I stared at the glowing image, studying the smug, victorious smile plastered across her young face. A year ago, seeing another woman wearing my grandmother's jewelry in my own home would have shattered me. I would have collapsed onto the floor and wept. But looking at the screen now, I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel a shred of sorrow. I felt a deep, chilling sense of absolute clarity. They wanted to take everything I owned. I was going to gladly return the favor. I slid my phone across the desk toward my father. "Look at what she is wearing," I said, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. Thomas picked up the device and adjusted his reading glasses. His eyes narrowed sharply as he recognized the vintage diamond pendant. He read the arrogant caption beneath the photograph, and a muscle ticked violently in his jaw. He placed the phone back on the desk with a heavy sigh. They truly believe there are no consequences for their actions. he murmured, turning his gaze back to the massive server arrays. They think they have already won the war. I took my seat beside him and woke up the secure banking terminal. I am tired of waiting, I said, my fingers hovering over the mechanical keyboard. They are hosting a massive high society gala tomorrow night to officially introduce her to their elite circle. Barbara wants to parade her new daughter-in-law in front of the entire country club. I want to give them an unforgettable party favor. Give the green light, Thomas. Bring down the hammer. My father did not hesitate. He leaned forward and accessed the master control portal for Oakmont Trust. As the newly acquired owner of the regional bank Apex Holdings, possessed absolute authority over every single loan portfolio, mortgage, and line of credit in their system. Thomas pulled up the master file for Barbara and her heavily leveraged Connecticut estate. The screen illuminated with the staggering weight of her fraudulent debt. Because Barbara had explicitly lied on her official loan applications, submitting forged tax returns, and fabricated investment portfolios, she was currently in massive violation of federal banking covenants. In the world of high finance, application fraud was not just a minor penalty. It was an immediate catastrophic breach of contract. It allowed the holding institution to bypass standard collection procedures and execute a total financial recall. Thomas initiated the command protocol. He navigated to the specific legal mechanism buried deep within the bank security agreements. It was called the acceleration clause. This powerful stipulation allowed the lender to instantly demand the entire outstanding balance of a loan if the borrower committed an act of fraud. Thomas typed in his administrative override codes, verifying the action through the secure biometric scanner. The heavy steel door of the basement seemed to hum in response as the servers processed the massive command. He hit the execute key. With a single keystroke, Thomas legally triggered the acceleration clause on every single mortgage tied to Barbara and her estate. The system immediately compiled the formal notice of default, generating a legally binding demand for total repayment. The automated banking system routed the emergency demand to a specialized legal courier service, located just 10 miles from the Connecticut estate. The document detailed the exact nature of the application fraud, citing the fabricated tax documents and the forged accountant signatures. It clearly stated that the protective terms of the original mortgage were now completely null and void. The bank was no longer interested in collecting monthly interest payments. They wanted the entire principal returned immediately. I watched the final figures tally on the monitor. Barbara owed exactly $1.5 million. She had absolutely no liquid assets, no genuine savings, and maxed out credit limits. She was entirely trapped in a web of her own deceit. I reviewed the finalized legal demand before Thomas dispatched it to the courier. The bank was demanding the $1.5 million balance in full, paid by certified check or secure wire transfer. The bank afforded her zero grace period for negotiation. The notice explicitly stated that she had exactly 48 hours to produce the funds, or the bank would seize the property, freeze her remaining personal accounts, and initiate a formal investigation into the loan fraud. I looked closely at the expiration timestamp automatically generated by the legal software. The 48-hour window would expire precisely at 9 in the evening. The deadline was tomorrow. The deadline would run out right in the middle of her extravagant New Year Eve party. The secure computer terminal chimed loudly, officially confirming that the local legal courier had successfully received all the printed documents and was currently en route to the massive, sprawling estate. The final countdown had officially begun, starting right now. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The legal machine was already moving, and there was no reason to rush what could no longer be stopped. Somewhere across town, Barbara's perfect little kingdom was about to receive the first official crack in its foundation. I sat back, letting the hum of the servers wash over me. My secure mobile phone vibrated, pulling my attention away from the banking terminal. I picked it up and saw a message notification. The sender was listed as Jason. I unlocked the screen and opened the text thread, expecting a barrage of threats from his corporate lawyers regarding the custody arrangement. Instead, I found a photograph. It was a picture of a white Porsche convertible sitting on the showroom floor of an exotic car dealership. A second message popped up immediately after the image. The tone was unmistakable. It was not Jason, it was Brittany. She was using his phone to reach me, knowing I had blocked her personal number. The message read exactly like the gloating caption from her social media post earlier that morning. She wrote she was just picking out her New Year Eve present. She told me I should get used to taking the bus, because Jason was upgrading his life in every possible way. She ended the text saying out with the old and in with the better. She even included a little waving hand emoji. I stared at the screen, feeling a strange sense of fascination. Brittany was sitting in a dealership picking out a vehicle she expected Jason to buy with embezzled corporate funds. She was completely oblivious that a legal courier was currently driving to the Connecticut estate to demand $1.5 million. She truly believed she had won the ultimate prize. She thought she had secured a wealthy executive who would bankroll her lifestyle indefinitely. I set the phone down and looked over at my father. He was watching me, his hands resting on the keyboard. "I think it is time we took a closer look at the new woman in Jason's life," I said. "We know she is named as a co-signer on the Cayman Islands account, but I want to know everything else. I want to know exactly who Jason brought into my home." Thomas nodded and pulled up a search interface. Apex Holdings possessed access to background verification software, normally used to vet high-level corporate executives. Thomas typed Brittany's legal name into the search bar and hit enter. The system began scraping through public records, court dockets, financial histories, and previous residential addresses. The progress bar crawled across the screen as the algorithm compiled a comprehensive profile of the 24-year-old woman who had stolen my life. Within minutes, the screen populated with a staggering amount of data. Thomas leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he began to read through the results. His eyebrows raised in surprise. "Well," he murmured, his voice laced with grim amusement, "it seems your husband is not the only one harboring secrets." I pulled my chair closer to the monitor and scanned the detailed report. Brittany was not just a naive young woman who had fallen for a charming older executive. She was a seasoned professional. The background check revealed a long and concerning history. 3 years ago, she had been charged with felony wire fraud in a neighboring state. She avoided jail time by accepting a plea deal and cooperating with authorities against her accomplices. But that was just the beginning of her legal history. I scrolled down to the civil litigation section. There were 2 separate lawsuits filed against her in the last 4 years. Both cases had been quietly settled out of court and sealed by expensive attorneys. But the software Thomas was using managed to pull the original filing documents. The plaintiffs in both lawsuits were wealthy married corporate executives. The pattern was identical in both cases. Brittany would target a successful older man, initiate an affair, and convince him to leave his wife. Once the man was isolated from his family and going through an expensive divorce, she would convince him to move his assets into joint accounts for safekeeping. As soon as the hidden funds cleared, the new accounts, Brittany would drain the money and vanish. She was a predator who specialized in ruining marriages and stealing from arrogant men who thought they were outsmarting their wives. I sat back, letting the gravity of the discovery settle over me. Jason thought he was the mastermind. He thought he was cleverly hiding his embezzled corporate funds in the Cayman Islands to keep the money away from me during the divorce. He had named Brittany as the co-signer on that account because he thought she was a loyal, compliant mistress. He had no idea he had just handed the keys to his illicit fortune to a woman who made her living robbing executives exactly like him. She was planning to drain the Cayman account the moment the embezzlement cleared and disappear, leaving him to face the corporate auditors and the federal authorities alone. It was a beautiful, poetic disaster. "We need to make sure Jason understands exactly who he invited into his bed," I said, a cold smile forming on my lips. "If the bank foreclosure hits him while he still thinks Brittany is his loyal partner, he might try to use the offshore funds to save the house. We need him to realize that the offshore money is not safe. We need to crack his confidence right now." Thomas opened a locked drawer and pulled out a prepaid burner phone. He handed the cheap plastic device across the table. It was untraceable, purchased with cash, and never connected to our home network. I took the phone and powered it on. I drafted a new text message, typing carefully on the small keypad. I wanted the message to sound like a warning from a concerned colleague. "Check your blind spot," the message read. "You are being played by the woman in your house. Look at the attached files before you lose everything. Do not trust the offshore accounts." I connected the burner phone to the terminal and downloaded the PDF copies of Brittany's previous civil lawsuits and her wire fraud indictment. I attached the damaging legal files directly to the text message. I verified the number for Jason's personal mobile device and hit send. I placed the burner phone on the desk and waited. Thanks to the cloning software I had installed on Jason's laptop the day before, we had established a backdoor connection to his personal home network. Thomas brought up a monitoring window tracking the data traffic moving across the router. We did not have to wait long. Within 3 minutes, the monitoring software showed a massive spike in activity from Jason's specific mobile device IP address. He had received the anonymous text message. I watched the data logs light up as he frantically opened the attached PDF files. The data packets showed him downloading the court dockets, reading through the detailed lawsuits filed by the other ruined executives. The monitoring screen showed his device suddenly accessing the secure portal for the Cayman Islands offshore bank. He was logging in to check the balance. His paranoia was instantly spiking off the charts. He was now completely distracted. He had absolutely no idea that a legal courier had just pulled into his driveway, holding a certified bank notice that would shatter his world. The heavy tires of the courier vehicle crunched against the pristine gravel as it came to a halt right in front of the grand mahogany doors. Inside the opulent estate, Barbara was busy directing a team of florists who were arranging massive displays of white winter roses for the upcoming gala. She was in her element, barking orders and adjusting the placement of crystal vases. When the sharp rap of the heavy brass knocker echoed through the grand foyer, she let out an irritated sigh. She waved away her hired help and marched toward the entrance, fully expecting a late delivery of premium champagne or imported caviar. She pulled the door open, preparing a sharp reprimand for the driver, but stopped when she saw the unsmiling man standing on her welcome mat. He wore a dark uniform and held a thick, rigid envelope marked with severe red lettering. He asked for her by her full legal name. Barbara offered a tight, confused nod. He handed her an electronic clipboard for her signature. She signed it with a careless flick of the stylus, annoyed by the interruption. The courier handed over the thick envelope, turned on his heel, and walked back to his vehicle without another word. Barbara closed the heavy door and stood alone in the quiet foyer. She tore away the perforated edge of the cardboard envelope and pulled out the legal documents. Her eyes casually scanned the top of the first page, expecting routine banking correspondence. Instead, she saw the bold, terrifying header from Oakmont Trust. Her gaze locked onto the words "acceleration clause" and "formal notice of default." The color completely drained from her face. She read the specific paragraphs outlining her fabricated tax returns and the forged accountant signatures. The bank knew everything. She skipped down to the final demand at the bottom of the page. The lender was requiring the immediate payment of $1.5 million. The deadline was explicitly stated as 9 o'clock tomorrow evening, right in the middle of her precious New Year Eve gala. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble violently. The thick stack of papers rattled against each other. Her breath caught in her throat, refusing to reach her lungs. The grand foyer seemed to spin around her, the imported marble floors tilting beneath her feet. She leaned heavily against the sweeping staircase, gasping for air. The sheer terror of absolute public humiliation crushed her chest. The caterers were arriving tomorrow morning. The entire country club elite would be walking through these doors. If the bank foreclosed and seized the property, she would be the laughingstock of her entire social circle. She would lose her crown, her home, and her carefully constructed identity in a single devastating stroke. She needed money immediately. She needed Jason. Barbara practically ran down the long carpeted hallway, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the floorboards. She bypassed the formal dining room and pushed through the heavy oak door of her son's private home office. Jason was sitting behind his desk, staring intensely at his mobile phone. He was already sweating, a thin layer of perspiration glistening on his forehead. He had just read the anonymous text message about Brittany, and his mind was racing through the terrifying implications of her criminal past. He looked up sharply as his mother burst into the room, clutching a stack of papers against her chest like a shield. His irritation instantly flared. He was trying to manage a potential catastrophe with his mistress and the Cayman account, and he did not have the patience for whatever trivial party planning disaster his mother was currently obsessing over. He opened his mouth to scold her for entering without knocking, but the words died in his throat when he saw her face. Barbara was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull oxygen into her panicked lungs. Her eyes were wide and wild, completely devoid of their usual haughty arrogance. She stumbled forward and slapped the thick legal documents down onto his pristine leather blotter. The bank knows, she choked out her voice, a desperate wheezing gasp. They know about the tax returns, Jason. They know about the portfolio signatures. They executed something called an acceleration clause. Jason felt a cold spike of adrenaline pierce his stomach. He abandoned his phone and grabbed the documents, his eyes darting across the legal demands. Barbara gripped the edge of his desk, her knuckles turning white. They want $1.5 million, Jason. They want it in full by tomorrow night. The deadline is 9 o'clock. The guests will be here. The band will be playing. If I do not pay them, they are going to take the house. They are going to freeze my personal accounts. You have to fix this. You have to give me the money right now. Jason stared at the bank notice, his mind fracturing under the immense pressure. His entire world was suddenly collapsing from multiple directions. Brittany was potentially a seasoned con artist preparing to drain his offshore funds, and now his mother was facing imminent foreclosure right before the biggest social event of the year. The timing was too perfect, too catastrophic. He felt the walls of his expensive office closing in around him. But Jason was a man built on arrogance and ego. He had spent his entire life playing the role of the golden boy, the unstoppable executive who could charm and maneuver his way out of any consequence. He refused to let his mother see him break. He refused to admit that his carefully constructed empire of lies was crumbling into dust. He forced his features into a mask of total calm, suppressing the rising tide of absolute panic. He slowly placed the foreclosure notice back onto the desk and offered his mother a tight, reassuring smile. "Take a deep breath, Mom," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "You are overreacting. This is just an aggressive tactic from a regional bank trying to strong-arm their clients. It is nothing I cannot handle." Barbara stared at him, her eyes pleading for salvation. "Do you have the money?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Can you pay them off before the party?" "I have millions in liquid capital parked in an offshore investment account." Jason lied smoothly, leaning back in his leather chair to project total confidence. "I can initiate a direct wire transfer right now and wipe out this entire mortgage before the bank even opens tomorrow morning." The relief that washed over Barbara's face was instantaneous and profound. She let out a long, shaky breath, pressing a hand to her chest. She had raised her son to be a ruthless provider, and he was finally delivering on that promise. "Oh, thank God," she whispered, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. "I knew I could count on you, Jason. Go rest." Barbara hurried out of the room. The moment the door clicked shut, Jason dropped his calm facade. His hands began to shake with raw terror. He locked the door and sprinted back to his desk. He needed to move the Cayman Island funds right this second, before Brittany could steal them. He flipped open his laptop and loaded the hidden offshore portal. He quickly entered his extremely complex offshore login credentials. The screen flashes read, "Access denied. Per Erica's instructions, Mr. Carter has quietly frozen all of Jason's corporate and connected accounts. Jason is completely penniless." He slammed his fist against the heavy oak desk, sending a crystal pen holder crashing to the floor. The red warning message pulsed on the screen, mocking his carefully constructed reality. Access denied. The words burned into his retinas. He hammered the refresh button, his fingers slipping on the keys, but the screen remained locked. The Cayman Islands account was sealed. His entire safety net, his stolen millions, his pristine escape plan had vanished into thin air. A cold, suffocating dread washed over him, replacing the initial shock with pure terror. His mind raced back to the anonymous text message he had received just hours earlier. He pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at the downloaded court dockets, the wire fraud indictments, the detailed lawsuits from other wealthy executives. "Check your blind spot," the warning had said. The pieces snapped together in his mind, forming a horrifying picture. Brittany. It had to be Brittany. She was the only other person listed as a secondary signer on the offshore corporate charter. She was the only one who had the legal authorization to authorize a massive transfer. She had played him. She had spent the last 6 months playing the role of the infatuated young girlfriend, coaxing him into putting her name on the accounts. Now, just hours before his mother was about to lose her estate, she had drained every single penny and locked him out. He pushed himself away from the desk, his chair rolling backward and hitting the bookshelf. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. He tore out of the home office and marched down the hallway. He could hear the faint sound of pop music playing from the master suite upstairs. He took the grand mahogany staircase 2 steps at a time, his leather shoes thudding heavily against the carpet. He reached the top landing and shoved the heavy bedroom door open. Brittany was sitting at my antique vanity mirror, carefully applying a coat of shimmering lip gloss. She was already wearing the plunging red dress she had chosen for the gala. My grandmother vintage diamond pendant rested perfectly against her collarbone. She looked up at his reflection in the mirror, offering a pouty, annoyed frown at the sudden intrusion. "Do you mind?" she asked, turning back to her makeup. "I am trying to get ready for tonight." Jason crossed the room in 3 long strides, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her up from the velvet stool. Brittany let out a sharp cry of surprise, dropping her lip gloss onto the floor. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she shrieked, trying to pull her arm away. Jason tightened his grip, his face inches from hers. "Where is the money?" he snarled, his voice shaking with uncontrolled rage. "Where did you transfer the Cayman funds, Brittany? Do not play stupid with me." "I read the dockets. I saw the wire fraud indictments from your past. I know exactly what you do to married executives." Brittany stared at him, her initial shock dissolving into genuine confusion. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, pushing hard against his chest. "I did not touch your stupid offshore account. I do not even know the master login password. You never gave it to me." She wrenched her arm free and rubbed her wrist, glaring at him with pure venom. Jason stepped forward, backing her against the edge of the large king-sized bed. "Do not lie to me," he shouted. "The account is locked. The money is gone. You are the only other authorized signer on that charter. You drained it so you could run away." Brittany crossed her arms, her manicured nails digging into her bare skin. The realization slowly dawned on her face, replacing her anger with a cold, calculating panic. "The money is gone," she repeated slowly. "What do you mean the money is gone?" "You promised me a brand new white Porsche convertible tonight, Jason. You told me the dealership was delivering it before the guests arrived. You promised me that car for New Year Eve. You told me you had millions hidden away." Jason let out a harsh, unhinged laugh, running a hand through his styled hair. "There is no car," he yelled, throwing his arms out wide. "There is no money. The bank is foreclosing on this house tonight because my mother committed application fraud. They want $1.5 million by 9 o'clock, and my offshore accounts are frozen. We have absolutely nothing." Brittany's jaw dropped. The glamorous illusion she had bought into was shattering right in front of her eyes. "You are broke!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the master bedroom. "You brought me into this massive house. You convinced me to put up with your awful mother, and you do not even have a dime to your name. You are a complete fraud." She pushed past him, marching toward the massive walk-in closet. I am not staying here for this, she yelled, grabbing a leather overnight bag from the top shelf. I am not going down with a sinking ship. Jason grabbed the bag, pulling it out of her hands and throwing it across the room. You are not leaving, he roared. You are staying right here, and you are going to tell me exactly how to bypass the Cayman security protocols. The screaming match intensified, their voices layering over each other in a chaotic symphony of mutual destruction. The heavy bedroom door swung open, hitting the wall with a loud bang. Barbara stood in the threshold, clutching a silver serving tray. Her face was deathly pale and a thin sheen of nervous sweat coated her forehead. Stop screaming, she commanded, her voice trembling violently. The caterers are downstairs unloading the floral arrangements. The waitstaff is setting up the champagne fountains in the ballroom. I will not have my staff listening to you two brawling like common street thugs. Jason turned to his mother, his chest heaving. We have a problem, Mom, he said, his voice cracking under the pressure. The offshore accounts are completely inaccessible. I cannot wire the money to the bank. We cannot stop the foreclosure. Barbara squeezed her eyes shut, aggressively shaking her head from side to side. No, she whispered loudly. No, I refuse to listen to this. I refuse to accept this negativity right now. The state senator is coming tonight. The regional medical director is coming. I will not allow this ridiculous banking error to ruin the most important social event of the entire season. You will both put your nice clothes on. You will march downstairs and you will smile. We are going to greet our guests and pretend everything is perfectly fine. The bank will just have to wait until tomorrow. We will figure it out in the morning. She turned and marched blindly back down the hallway, consumed by total denial. Jason and Brittany stared at each other, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. Hours passed in suffocating tension as evening finally fell over the estate. The deep winter darkness settled across the manicured lawns. The heavy wrought iron gates swung open and the first luxury cars began to pull into the driveway. Jason and Brittany stood side by side in the grand foyer, their bodies rigid with sheer terror. They plastered on fake smiles, unaware that the clock was ticking down to their absolute destruction. The grand ballroom of the estate transformed into a glittering spectacle of wealth and excess. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over the imported marble floors, while a live jazz band played smooth melodies. Waitstaff in crisp white uniforms circulated, offering silver trays loaded with caviar and vintage champagne. The local political figures, corporate executives, and high society socialites mingled in their expensive tuxedos and designer gowns, completely oblivious to the financial ruin hovering over the host family. The atmosphere was intoxicatingly arrogant. Jason stood near the massive stone fireplace, holding court with a group of regional directors from competing firms. He was drinking heavily, tossing back his bourbon with a frantic rhythm to mask the sheer terror clawing at his insides. His face was flushed, and he laughed too loudly at jokes, making sweeping gestures with his hands as he boasted about his recent corporate successes. He talked about aggressive expansion strategies and massive profit margins, playing the role of the unstoppable apex predator of the business world. He desperately needed the room to believe the illusion, because the reality was tearing him apart. Brittany stood rigidly by his side, wearing her plunging red dress and my grandmother vintage diamond pendant. She clutched a flute of champagne so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes darted toward the front entrance, searching for a way out. She knew the Cayman accounts were frozen. She knew Jason was penniless and the bank was going to seize the estate. Every time a guest complimented her dress, she offered a brittle smile that vanished the second they turned away. She was trapped, pretending to be the queen of a castle that was actively crumbling. Barbara fluttered through the room, adjusting floral arrangements. She wore an emerald gown and a mask of total denial. She simply willed the foreclosure away, focusing entirely on her prestige. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed loudly, signaling the approaching midnight hour. The party was reaching its peak of loud chatter. Then the heavy front double doors swung open with a resounding crash that cut through the noise. A gust of frigid winter wind swept into the grand foyer, causing the candle flames to flicker wildly. The sudden blast of cold air drew the attention of the guests. The conversation began to die down, spreading like a ripple across the room until a heavy, expectant silence settled over the ballroom. The jazz band faltered, playing a few discordant notes, before the musicians lowered their instruments, completely unsure of what was happening. Every eye in the room turned toward the open doorway. I stepped over the threshold and walked into the bright light of the foyer. I was no longer wearing the conservative, modest clothing Jason had always demanded I wear to blend into the background. I was not the quiet, submissive wife who kept her head down and let her husband steal the spotlight. I wore a breathtaking, custom-tailored black Valentino gown that hugged my frame and swept across the floor with absolute authority. The dark fabric absorbed the light, making me look like a shadow cast over their glittering illusion. My hair was styled sharply, and my posture radiated the kind of quiet, immense power that money alone could never buy. I was stepping into my true identity. I was not alone. Thomas walked calmly by my side. He was no longer dressed in the practical, unassuming clothing of an estate manager. He wore a razor-sharp charcoal brioni suit that fit him with lethal precision. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his expression was carved from stone. He moved with the quiet, lethal grace of a man who commanded absolute respect. Flanking us on either side were two massive men in dark, tailored suits. They were elite corporate security contractors dispatched directly from the Apex Holdings Executive Protection Division. They stood well over 6 feet tall, their eyes scanning the room with cold professional detachment. Their presence instantly changed the dynamic of the room. This was not a friendly holiday visit. This was a hostile corporate takeover. Jason stopped mid-sentence, his glass of bourbon freezing halfway to his mouth. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost illuminated by the fireplace. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and rising panic. He looked at the Valentino gown, the corporate security guards, and the absolute, unyielding confidence in my expression. His mind struggled to process the image. This was not the woman he thought he had manipulated and discarded. This was a woman who held his entire fate in the palm of her hand. Brittany let out a sharp gasp, stepping backward and bumping into a side table. Her champagne spilled onto the expensive rug. She recognized the look in my eyes, and she knew instantly that the anonymous text message, the frozen offshore accounts, and the impending foreclosure were all connected to me. She realized she had walked directly into a trap that I had meticulously set. Barbara was standing near the grand staircase talking to a local judge when she saw me enter. Her face instantly contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. The denial she had been clinging to all evening snapped. She saw my presence as a direct, deliberate insult to her authority and a threat to her flawless party. She handed her wineglass to a passing waiter and stormed across the ballroom floor. Her heavy emerald gown swished aggressively around her ankles as she marched toward the foyer. Her face was flushed dark red with indignation. "How dare you show your face in my home?" Barbara shrieked, her shrill voice echoing through the deafening silence of the ballroom. The guests murmured nervously, stepping back to give her a wide berth. She stopped a few feet away from me, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at my face. "You are not welcome here. You are trespassing." She shifted her furious gaze to Thomas, looking him up and down with deep aristocratic disgust. "And you?" She snarled, her lip curling into a sneer. "You are nothing but the help. You have absolutely no right to walk through my front doors. Get out of my house right this second before I have you both arrested." I did not flinch. I simply looked at her with chilling detachment. "This is my property!" Barbara yelled, turning wildly, looking for her hired event security. The 4 men in matching blazers were standing near the coat check, watching the scene unfold with hesitant expressions. Barbara snapped her fingers at them with vicious authority. "You men get over here right now," she ordered, pointing directly at me. "I want this woman and her entourage removed from my property immediately. Throw the ex-wife and the help out into the snow where they belong." The hired guards slowly stepped forward, moving to intercept us. Barbara crossed her arms over her chest, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. The event security guards closed the distance, stopping just a few feet away from my corporate protection detail. The lead event guard looked at my face. He looked at the custom Valentino gown, the imposing Brioni suit Thomas wore, and the two massive apex-holding security contractors staring back at him. The hired guard swallowed hard. He gave me a respectful nod. He turned to his team and motioned. In complete silence, the hired event security guard stepped completely aside, clearing a wide, unobstructed path for me to walk directly into the party. I stepped through the path the guards had cleared, feeling the entire ballroom shift around me like a living thing holding its breath. The music had stopped completely now. Crystal glasses hovered halfway to painted lips. Men in tuxedos turned away from their conversations, their expressions changing from curiosity to recognition, then from recognition to the sharp hunger of scandal. These were the same people who had smiled politely at me for years while treating me like decorative background furniture. They had watched Jason speak over me at dinners, watched Barbara correct my posture, my clothes, my recipes, my tone. Not one of them had ever wondered why I stayed so quiet. Tonight they were finally going to learn that silence was not weakness. It was preparation. Thomas walked beside me with perfect calm, one hand resting near the button of his Brioni jacket. He did not scan the room nervously. He did not hurry. He moved as if the estate, the guests, the chandeliers, and every polished inch of marble beneath our feet had already been entered into a ledger and quietly acquired. The two apex security contractors widened their position just enough to make the message clear without saying a word. No one was going to touch me. No one was going to drag me out. No one was going to treat me like the frightened wife they had thrown into the snow. Barbara stood frozen near the staircase, her emerald gown glittering under the chandelier light. For one fleeting second, I saw true fear flash beneath her outrage. She had expected tears. She had expected begging. She had expected me to arrive in an old sweater, head bowed, asking for mercy in exchange for a few hours with my daughter. Instead, I had walked into her most important social event, dressed like judgment itself. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her wineglass until I thought the crystal might crack. She glanced toward the hired event guards again, but they were already staring at the floor, unwilling to challenge the men standing at my sides. Brittany was standing beside the massive stone fireplace, one hand pressed against the diamond pendant at her throat. My grandmother's necklace caught the golden light each time she moved, throwing small, cruel sparks across her collarbone. She tried to lift her chin with the same smug confidence she had displayed online, but the effect failed. Her eyes kept darting from me to Thomas, then to the security contractors, then back to Jason. She was beginning to understand that she had not stolen a broken woman's place. She had walked into the center of a war. She was not equipped to survive. The guests whispered louder as I crossed the room. I heard fragments floating through the air. Jason's wife. The mechanic. Who are those men? Why is she dressed like that? Is that really her father? Every word fed the tension building under the ceiling. The old social circle that Barbara had spent fraudulent money to impress was turning into a jury before her eyes. No one was laughing now. No one was raising a glass. They were watching the mask slip from a family that had spent years pretending to be untouchable. At the far end of the ballroom, Jason still stood near the fireplace with a half-empty bourbon glass in his hand. His face had gone pale when I entered, but as I approached, the shock hardened into rage. I watched the exact moment humiliation overpowered fear. His mother's guards had stepped aside for me. His guests were staring. His mistress was shrinking behind him. The carefully polished image of the powerful executive, the adored son, the wealthy provider, was collapsing in public before the first accusation had even been spoken. He shoved his bourbon glass into the hands of a stunned regional director and stepped away from the fireplace. The crowd parted quickly, not out of respect, but out of instinctive self-preservation. Jason moved toward me with the reckless confidence of a man who had always mistaken volume for power. His expensive shoes struck the marble too hard. His jaw was clenched so tightly a vein pulsed near his temple. I did not slow down. I did not look away. Every step I took reminded him that I was no longer outside in the cold with my child in my arms. I was inside his kingdom and the doors had opened for me. When he came within a few feet, the apex guards shifted forward in perfect unison. It was a small movement, almost elegant, but it stopped him cold. Jason's eyes flicked toward their shoulders, their hands, their unreadable faces. For the first time that night, he realized physical intimidation would not work. Legal intimidation would not work. His mother's name would not work. His borrowed confidence would not work. He was standing in front of the woman he had underestimated for years, and every weapon he thought he had was already gone. The silence between us became almost unbearable. Behind him, Barbara took one shaky step forward, as if she wanted to intervene, then stopped when Thomas turned his head slightly in her direction. Brittany swallowed hard, her fingers still locked around my stolen necklace. I let Jason stand there, in the center of his own unraveling, surrounded by the people he had lied to, with nowhere left to hide. Only then did he lean closer, lowering his voice into a furious whisper meant to sound dangerous. "What do you think you are doing?" He hissed, his voice a harsh, desperate whisper meant only for my ears. He leaned in close, trying to project the absolute dominance he no longer possessed. "You are completely out of your mind, Erica. You think you can just crash my New Year's Eve gala with a couple of rented bodyguards and embarrass my family in front of my colleagues? I am going to destroy you for this." I maintained my perfectly neutral expression, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. My silence only fueled his panic. "You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with." He spat out a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. "I will drag you through civil court for the next decade. I will tie you up in so much endless litigation you will never see the light of day. I have millions of dollars at my disposal, Erica. I will bury you in aggressive legal fees until you are begging for a settlement. I will take every single thing you own and leave you completely broke out on the street." I listened to his frantic threats, feeling a profound sense of pity mixed with deep vindication. He was still clinging to the grand illusion of his wealth, completely unaware that I already knew his offshore Cayman accounts were frozen solid. He was threatening me with money he no longer possessed. "You are going to regret stepping foot in this house." He growled, his hands clenching into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides. I offered him a slow, chilling smile. I stepped smoothly around him, completely ignoring his empty threats. He reached out to grab my arm, but Thomas swiftly stepped into his path, blocking him with an immovable shoulder. "Do not even think about touching her," Thomas warned, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. Jason stumbled back, his jaw dropping in absolute shock at the blatant disrespect from a man he had always considered so far beneath him. I continued my deliberate walk across the ballroom floor. The wealthy guests scrambled to get out of my way, their eyes wide with scandalized fascination. I could hear their hushed whispers catching fragments of wild gossip as I glided past their meticulously decorated tables. They recognized me as Jason's discarded wife, but the woman they remembered was a quiet, subservient wallflower. They had never seen this powerful version of me. I approached the raised wooden stage where the live jazz band was currently stationed. The musicians were exchanging nervous, panicked glances, their playing growing increasingly disjointed as the heavy tension in the room thickened. I stepped up the short flight of carpeted stairs, my heels clicking with precise, steady rhythm. The female vocalist was holding a vintage microphone, looking completely paralyzed by the unfolding drama happening right in front of her. I walked directly up to her and extended my right hand. She blinked in sheer surprise, then slowly surrendered the microphone without uttering a single word of protest. I turned to face the entire room. The lead saxophone player lowered his brass instrument, and the drummer tapped his cymbals one last time before bringing the soothing music to a harsh, grinding halt. The sudden lack of music created an absolute suffocating vacuum in the grand ballroom. The silence was heavy and expectant. Every single face in the crowd was turned up toward the stage, waiting for my next move. I looked out over the expansive sea of wealthy corporate executives, local politicians, and snobby country club socialites. I saw Jason standing frozen near the center of the room, his fists still clenched in helpless fury. I saw Brittany hovering near the warm fireplace, her face completely drained of color, as she realized the true devastating scale of the disaster she was currently caught in. And I saw Barbara violently pushing her way to the very front of the crowd, her expensive emerald gown swishing furiously around her ankles. I tapped the microphone once, and the sharp, high-pitched feedback echoed off the vaulted ceilings, instantly commanding absolute attention. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the massive, opulent space. "I am incredibly glad you all could make it tonight. Welcome to the estate. I truly hope you are enjoying the exquisite catering and the wonderful music." The high society guests shifted uncomfortably, trading deeply confused glances with one another. Barbara marched right up to the very edge of the wooden stage, her face trembling with unfiltered, arrogant outrage. "How dare you speak to my distinguished guests?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling manicured finger up at my face. "Get off that stage immediately and get out of my house." I looked down at her with a calm, serene smile. "Actually, Barbara, I am exactly where I need to be," I replied, the microphone amplifying my steady, unwavering voice. I slowly opened my designer clutch and reached inside. My fingers brushed against the crisp, heavy paper waiting inside. I pulled out a folded legal document stamped with the official seal of the county clerk and the bold, intimidating letterhead of Oakmont Trust. I crouched down gracefully, balancing perfectly in my expensive heels, and extended the document down to her. "This belongs to you," I said softly. Barbara snatched the paper from my hand, her eyes filled with venomous pride. She aggressively snapped the document open, fully intending to tear it to shreds in front of her high society friends. I watched as her eyes locked onto the header. It was the finalized foreclosure and immediate eviction notice. Over the microphone, I announced, "Enjoy the champagne. As of 9 p.m., Apex Holdings officially owns this property, and you are all trespassing." The wail of sirens grew louder, piercing the silence of the ballroom. Flashing red and blue lights began reflecting through the high arched windows, casting an eerie glow over the marble floors and the stunned faces of the guests. Mr. Carter turned his back on Jason with unforgiving finality and walked away, rejoining the crowd, which instinctively parted to let him pass. The high society guests, who had been drinking vintage champagne, were now whispering frantically and nervously, edging toward the exits. They wanted nothing to do with a man about to be hauled away in handcuffs. The illusion was permanently shattered. Brittany stood frozen near the massive fireplace. The damning words Mr. Carter had spoken echoed relentlessly in her panicked mind. Embezzlement. Felony charges. She looked at Jason, who was staring blankly at the floor in total shock, and then she shifted her terrified gaze to me. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with terrifying clarity. Jason was not a secret millionaire with offshore accounts. He was a desperate corporate thief caught red-handed. He did not legally own the estate she was standing inside. He was entirely broke, and the police were pulling up the circular driveway right at this very moment. The champagne flute slipped from her numb fingers. It shattered violently against the solid stone hearth, sending sharp shards flying in every direction. The sharp crash of breaking crystal jolted her paralyzed body into desperate action. She moved with frantic animal panic. She lunged toward a plush velvet chair where she had draped her designer winter coat earlier. She snatched the heavy fabric and threw it recklessly over her bare shoulders, not bothering to put her arms through the sleeves. She abandoned Jason completely without a second of hesitation. Her only goal was absolute self-preservation. She shoved past two wealthy socialites and sprinted wildly toward the rear of the ballroom, heading straight for the massive glass patio doors. She pushed frantically through the heavy velvet curtains and slammed her bare hands against the cold brass handles of the patio doors. She violently shoved one of the heavy glass doors open, letting in a sudden blast of freezing winter air. But before she could take a step outward onto the stone terrace, two tall figures emerged swiftly from the shadows of the back garden. They were a man and a woman dressed casually in unassuming winter coats. They stepped directly into the open doorway, blocking her escape completely. Brittany let out a sharp cry of frustration trying to push past their frames. The tall man held up a gold shield catching the dim light. "Police department," he said, his voice loud and commanding, absolute authority. "Brittany Blackwood, you are not going anywhere tonight." Brittany stumbled backward, shaking her head wildly in pure denial. "You cannot hold me here," she shrieked loudly, her voice trembling with rising hysteria. "I did not do anything wrong. I am just a guest at this party." The female plainclothes detective stepped forward and pulled a thick stack of printed legal documents from inside her winter coat. "We have a mountain of hard evidence that says otherwise," the detective stated in a calm tone. "We have the internal wire transfer logs, the digital signature authorizations, and the corporate charter documents for the offshore Cayman accounts. Your name is listed legally as a primary co-signer and authorized beneficiary on every fraudulent financial transfer Jason initiated over the last 6 months. You are fully implicated in a massive wire fraud conspiracy." Brittany stared down at the damning stack of papers, her jaw trembling uncontrollably. She collapsed heavily against the thick velvet curtains, sobbing loudly as the two detectives firmly instructed her to step back inside the house and keep her hands visible. While Brittany was being detained at the back of the crowded room, Jason finally broke down. The approaching sirens were now loud outside the front mahogany doors. The heavy footsteps of several uniformed police officers could clearly be heard, marching up the grand stone steps of the front entrance. Jason looked around the room wildly, feeling totally trapped inside a living nightmare. His mother Barbara was slumped against the grand staircase, weeping bitterly into her hands as her social standing evaporated right before her eyes. His corporate colleagues were turning their backs on him, muttering in disgust. He had nothing and no one left in his corner. He turned slowly back to face me, his chest heaving violently with rapid, shallow breaths. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily onto his knees on the cold marble floor right in front of where I stood, landing with a dull thud. The expensive fabric of his tailored suit pooled messily around him as he looked up at me, with desperate tears streaming steadily down his flushed face. "Erica, please." He choked out, his voice cracking terribly into a pathetic, ragged sob. "Please do not do this to me. I will gladly give you every single thing back. I will sign whatever legal document you want me to sign. Just please call off your corporate security and call off Mr. Carter. I cannot go to federal prison, Erica. I cannot possibly survive in a terrible place like that." I looked down at the pathetic, weeping man, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, empty detachment. He reached his hand out and desperately grasped the bottom hem of my Valentino gown, his fingers trembling violently as he gripped the soft fabric. "Think about our beautiful daughter," he begged loudly, his broken voice echoing clearly through the silent ballroom. "Think about little Lily. She really needs her loving father, Erica. You cannot send her father away to a federal penitentiary for years. It will completely destroy her heart. Please have a little mercy on me for the sake of our wonderful little girl. Do not tear our family apart like this." I stared silently at the broken man, kneeling helplessly in the dirt of his own deliberate making. He had never once thought about the well-being of our daughter, while he was draining our joint savings accounts, while he was carrying on a brazen public affair, and while he was actively trying to leave us with absolutely nothing to our names. I slowly reached my hand back into my sleek designer clutch. I pulled out a second formal legal folder, slightly thicker and heavier than the first. I looked down at his tear-streaked, pathetic face and calmly handed the heavy folder directly to him. Jason took the folder with visibly shaking hands, desperately hoping against all odds that it was some kind of generous settlement agreement or a miraculous legal way out of his current predicament. He opened it slowly and stared blindly at the bold black legal print displayed clearly on the very first page. "It is already completely finalized," I said, my voice carrying crisp and clear over the loud sound of the uniformed police officers finally entering the grand foyer directly behind me. "Those are official sole custody papers granted permanently by a family court judge just a few short hours ago." The judge firmly determined that your pending multiple felony indictments, your massive financial fraud, and your impending lengthy incarceration make you entirely and legally unfit to be a parent. I paused for a brief moment, letting the absolute finality of the situation sink deeply into his shattered mind. You simply do not have a daughter anymore, Jason. Jason stared at the thick legal packet in his trembling hands. The ink blurred as panicked tears flooded his eyes. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The absolute finality of the family court judge's signature severed his last tie to the world he controlled. He had used Lily as an emotional shield to garner unearned sympathy. Now she was legally out of his reach. He dropped the folder onto the marble floor and slumped forward, planting his hands on the ground. The heavy thud of tactical boots echoed through the foyer behind me. 4 uniformed police officers marched past the champagne fountains, moving with swift professional purpose. They cut through the crowd of terrified high society guests. The lead officer stepped around me and grabbed Jason by his tailored shoulder, hauling him up from the floor with rough, practiced efficiency. His body was completely limp, his spirit entirely broken by his total destruction. The officer spun him around and slammed his chest hard against the stone mantel of the fireplace. The sharp click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Jason's wrists echoed over the stunned murmurs. The officer read his Miranda rights in a loud, steady voice, detailing the federal indictments for corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. Jason squeezed his eyes shut, his face pressed against the cold stone as the reality of his impending prison sentence crushed the breath from his lungs. Across the room, the 2 plainclothes detectives were marching a sobbing, hysterical Brittany out through the patio doors, her bare shoulders shivering violently in the freezing winter air as they escorted her toward a squad car. The flashing red and blue lights painted the snow outside. Barbara stood paralyzed near the edge of the stage, clutching the crinkled foreclosure notice to her chest. She had just watched her golden child get hauled away in chains. She had watched his young mistress get arrested for draining the offshore accounts that were supposed to save their luxurious lifestyle. The intricately decorated walls of her prized estate seemed to violently close in on her. The expensive emerald gown she wore suddenly looked completely ridiculous, like a cheap theater costume on an aging actress who had tragically forgotten her lines. Her breathing turned into shallow, rapid gasps as her widened eyes darted frantically around the room. She looked desperately at the state senators and the wealthy country club wives she had spent decades trying to impress. They were staring at her with profound disgust and a sickening morbid pity. The absolute worst nightmare a devoted narcissist could imagine was happening to her in real time. She was being publicly and irreversibly humiliated in front of everyone who mattered. The sheer crushing weight of the staggering financial ruin and the total permanent destruction of her pristine social standing crashed down upon her shoulders all at once. Her weakened knees buckled violently beneath her. She let out a wretched guttural wail that tore painfully through her throat and collapsed heavily onto the hardwood floor. The foreclosure notice slipped from her numb fingers, landing near a puddle of spilled champagne. Barbara fell forward onto her hands and knees, her expensive diamond jewelry clattering loudly against the floorboards. She shook her head wildly, her styled hair falling across her tear-streaked face. This was the exact woman who had constantly belittled my humble upbringing and treated my father like a common filthy peasant, unworthy of stepping onto her property. She had built her fragile identity on a mountain of stolen wealth and vicious elitism. Now that mountain had turned to fine dust beneath her trembling hands. She slowly lifted her head, and her bloodshot eyes locked onto Thomas. The imposing man standing beside me in the flawless charcoal Brioni suit was the exact same man she had ordered to fix her kitchen sink just a few short months ago. He was the man she had called a grease monkey, the man she had tried to banish from her manicured driveway. The pieces of the terrifying puzzle finally slammed together in her mind. The vast capital required to orchestrate a covert takeover of Apex Holdings, the unyielding power required to instantly buy out her massive bank loans and trigger a foreclosure on a multi-million-dollar estate. It had not been some faceless corporate entity that ruined her. It had been him all along. My father was the quiet apex predator she had unwittingly invited into her life. A suffocating wave of unfiltered terror washed over her aging face. She realized with horrifying clarity that she was facing the boundless calculated wrath of a father fiercely protecting his only daughter. Pure desperation completely overrode her remaining scraps of aristocratic dignity. Barbara began to literally crawl across the expansive floor. She dragged her emerald gown awkwardly across the polished wood, pulling herself forward on her bare hands and bruised knees like a wounded, beaten animal. The wealthy guests gasped loudly, watching the former undisputed queen of local high society abase herself so completely in front of the entire town. She reached the edge of our secure perimeter and collapsed weakly near the polished leather of my father's expensive dress shoes. She reached out with violently trembling hands, her manicured fingers hovering just inches from his tailored trousers, deeply afraid to touch him. "Please," she sobbed, her voice a wet, pathetic gargle of absolute surrender. "Please, Mr. Carter. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Do not take my beautiful home. Do not throw me out into the freezing street tonight. I have absolutely nothing left in this world. Jason is completely gone. The money is entirely gone. My entire life is wrapped up inside these stone walls. I will do anything you ask of me. I will publicly apologize to Erica right now. I will scrub your floors until my hands bleed. Just please forgive the massive debts. You do not need this house at all. Please show a little simple mercy to a foolish old woman who made a terrible mistake." Thomas stood perfectly still, his large hands resting casually in the tailored pockets of his charcoal trousers. He looked down from his imposing height at the weeping, broken woman groveling pathetically in the dirt at his feet. There was absolutely zero sympathy visible in his cold, calculating eyes. There was no pity, no hesitation, and absolutely no mercy for the person who had caused his child so much pain. He had stood in the shadows and watched this arrogant woman systematically try to destroy my hard-earned confidence. He had silently listened to her vicious, unprovoked insults, and he had patiently, methodically plotted the exact, undeniable coordinates of her total corporate and personal annihilation. He slowly removed his hands from his pockets and crouched down slightly, bringing his stern, unyielding face much closer to hers. He moved with a calm, deliberate, muscular grace that made the terrifying threat of his sheer power even more palpable to everyone watching. The entire crowded ballroom held its collective breath in stunned anticipation. You could hear a single pin drop in the massive, opulent space as the elite guests strained their ears to hear the final execution of the once mighty Wilson family legacy. Thomas stared directly and piercingly into Barbara, tear-filled, terrified eyes stripping away her last shred of hope. His expression remained incredibly stoic, a flawless mask of unyielding, absolute authority. He delivered the crushing blow. "I told my daughter you picked the wrong family," Thomas whispers so the whole room can hear. "You should have listened." Barbara stared up at him, her mouth opening and closing silently. The sheer gravity of her mistake finally anchored in her chest. The quiet, unassuming mechanic she had treated with such venomous disdain was the architect of her ruin. She remained frozen on the floor, her trembling hands pressing against the cold hardwood as the reality of her new existence washed over her. Behind her, the arresting officers turned Jason toward the grand mahogany doors. His head hung in defeat, his shoulders slumping under the heavy weight of the steel handcuffs, securing his wrists. The heavy thud of the officers' boots, marching him across the foyer, cut through the stagnant air. Every wealthy guest politician and socialite stood in breathless, stunned silence. They watched the golden child of the Wilson Empire being escorted out of his own spectacular gala toward a waiting police cruiser. The red and blue lights illuminated his tear-stained face one last time before the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind him, sealing his fate. The suffocating quiet that followed was broken only by the sound of Barbara's ragged, hyperventilating breaths. Thomas straightened his posture and stepped back to stand at my side. He gave a sharp nod to the lead Apex security contractor near the archway. The massive man stepped forward, his dark suit blending into the shadows. He walked over to where Barbara was still kneeling. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded object. He dropped it onto the floor in front of her trembling knees. It was a flimsy black garbage bag. Barbara stared down at the plastic, her tear-filled eyes darting up to the security contractor in confusion. I took a deliberate step forward, looking down at the woman who had made it her mission to destroy my spirit. "Do you remember Christmas Eve, Barbara?" I asked, my voice echoing clearly through the quiet room. "Do you remember when you handed me a bag exactly like this one and told me to pack my miserable life into it? You told me I had 10 minutes to get off your property before you called the police to have me removed as a trespasser." Barbara choked on a fresh sob, her hands flying up to cover her face as the brutal poetry of the moment hit her. "You now have 30 minutes, I stated, my tone devoid of any sympathy. "You have 30 minutes to walk upstairs, strip off that emerald gown, and pack whatever necessities will fit inside that garbage bag. Once that time is up, my security team will escort you off the premises and lock the front gates. Anything you leave behind belongs to Apex Holdings to be liquidated." The humiliation of the ultimatum hung heavily in the air. Barbara looked toward the crowd of elites, pleading for someone to intervene, for someone to offer her a place to stay, or a word of comfort. Instead, her former friends and sycophants began averting their eyes. The toxicity of her situation was too immense for any of them to risk associating with her. The wealthy guests began moving toward the coat check and the exits. They moved silently, leaving their expensive champagne glasses resting on tables and mantels. They wanted to be as far away from the Wilson family collapse as possible. Barbara realized with a terrifying jolt that she was entirely alone. She reached out with a trembling hand and snatched the plastic bag from the floor. Using the edge of a nearby table, she hauled her exhausted body upward. She did not look at me or my father again. She simply turned and began the long, slow walk up the grand staircase, her gown dragging behind her like a chain. 30 minutes later, as promised, the security team escorted her out the front doors. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt and carrying a half-empty garbage bag over her shoulder. She walked out into the night, and the doors locked behind her with a satisfying click. 6 months passed, bringing the warm light of summer to replace the chill of that winter night. The shifting seasons had brought undeniable closure to the nightmare the Wilson family had created. Jason was residing in a federal penitentiary, having accepted a harsh plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial. He was serving 3 years in a sterile concrete cell, stripped of his bespoke suits, his bourbon, and his endless arrogance. The corporate world he had tried to conquer had forgotten his name, treating him as nothing more than a cautionary tale of greed and foolishness. Barbara had fared no better in the unforgiving light of reality. The foreclosure and the liquidation of her assets had left her destitute. Stripped of her country club memberships and her circle of friends, she had been forced to rent a dilapidated apartment on the outskirts of the city. To survive, the former queen of high society was now working a minimum-wage retail job at a local department store. She spent her exhausting days folding discounted sweaters and standing behind a cash register. Occasionally, women she used to invite to her galas would walk through her department. They would look right past her, treating her with the same invisibility she had once inflicted on the service workers she deemed so far beneath her. Her aristocratic facade was gone, forever replaced by the crushing weight of her permanent reality. I sat peacefully on the sprawling back stone patio of the restored estate, feeling the gentle golden morning sun warming my skin. The extensive, meticulously tended gardens were in full glorious bloom, bursting with bright, vibrant colors that danced gracefully in the warm, light summer breeze. I took a slow, calming sip of my dark coffee, savoring the absolute perfect tranquility that now fully enveloped the entire property. The massive house was finally fully legally mine, completely free of any remaining financial debts, toxic hidden secrets, or lingering dark memories. Out on the perfectly manicured green lawn, a beautiful, truly joyous sound broke the quiet morning air. Lily was running wildly through the lush, soft grass, her bright, innocent laughter echoing brightly toward the patio. She was eagerly chasing after Thomas, who was jogging playfully just ahead of her, a massive, genuinely warm smile breaking across his normally stoic, serious face. He scooped his precious granddaughter up into his strong, capable arms, gently spinning her around as she squealed loudly in pure, unfiltered delight. Watching my loving father and my sweet daughter share such a perfect, untainted moment of true happiness filled my chest with a profound, overwhelming sense of lasting peace. I rested my coffee mug on the wrought iron table and leaned back in my chair, letting out a long, contented breath. The long journey had been terrifying and deeply painful, but sitting here in the sunlight, I knew I had done exactly the right thing. I had not needed to become a vicious, heartless monster to get my rightful revenge. I had not needed to mirror the cruelty the Wilson family had shown me. I simply had to stop hiding my immense power. I had to step out of the shadows, embrace my true worth, and use my resources to completely neutralize the people who tried to break me. By doing so, I had secured an unbreakable, beautiful future for myself and for my little girl. We were finally safe, we were finally free, and our real lives were just beginning. Sometimes the hardest battle we face isn't against strangers, but against the very people who were supposed to protect and cherish us. When you spend years in the shadow of a toxic family dynamic, conditioned to believe that your worth is tied to your silence and subservience, it becomes incredibly easy to forget your own strength. We are often taught that keeping the peace is more important than protecting our peace. But as we have seen through this journey, true power does not require you to become the monster you are fighting. You do not need to mirror their cruelty, their deception, or their arrogance to win. True vindication comes from stepping out of the shadows and finally refusing to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. It comes from patiently building your own foundation, one constructed on integrity, quiet hard work, and self-respect, rather than a fragile house of cards built on lies, wire fraud, and manipulation. When you finally stop hiding your light and embrace your immense inherent power, the people who relied on your weakness will naturally fall under the weight of their own deception. Justice is rarely about loud, messy vengeance. It is about absolute, unyielding boundaries. It is about allowing the natural consequences of greed and arrogance to run their inevitable course while you focus on cultivating a beautiful, unbreakable future for yourself and the ones who truly matter. You owe nothing to those who only value you when you are small. Your only obligation is to your own growth, your own safety, and your own peace. Have you ever had to find the courage to walk away from a toxic dynamic? Or stand up to someone who constantly underestimated your worth? I would love to hear how you reclaimed your power. Share your story in the comments below. If this journey of profound resilience and sweet justice resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about overcoming the odds and finding your true strength. Remember, your worth is never determined by those who refuse to see it, and your peaceful future is always worth fighting for.